She looked across my mahogany dining table with the kind of serene confidence that comes from believing you've outsmarted everyone in the room, her crimson lips curving into a smile as she complimented the hand-painted ceramic centerpiece I'd spent hours arranging. What Rachel Montgomery didn't know was that in exactly 38 minutes, her own husband would walk through my front door carrying flowers meant for me, and that perfectly composed expression would shatter into something I'd been dreaming about for the past 4 months. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. Sometimes life has a twisted sense of poetry, doesn't it? Before we dive into this story that changed my entire world, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever felt like someone was playing games with your life, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I'm sharing another story about justice served cold that I promise will leave you speechless. My name is Victoria Ashford, and I'm about to tell you the most satisfying story of my 34 years on this earth. This isn't just about catching a cheating husband or exposing a manipulative mistress, though there's plenty of both. This is about the night I orchestrated the most perfect revelation of betrayal that Millbrook Heights has ever witnessed, and how one carefully planned dinner party became the moment when 2 marriages exploded in spectacular fashion, while 8 dinner guests watched in absolute horror. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't really about revenge, even though that's exactly what it became. It's about the moment when everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and the people closest to me turned out to be an elaborate lie that had been constructed over months of careful deception. I'm a senior forensic accountant at Pemberton, and associates here in Millbrook Heights, Connecticut, which means I spend my days uncovering financial fraud, tracing hidden assets, and following paper trails that other people thought they'd covered perfectly. I have a gift for seeing patterns, where others see chaos, for finding the single thread that, when pulled, unravels entire schemes that took years to construct. It's what makes me exceptional at my job, and it's what made me realize that the same skills I use to catch white-collar criminals could be turned on my own personal life with devastating effectiveness. Until 6 months ago, I believed I was living the life I'd always dreamed of. My husband, James Ashford, is a successful orthopedic surgeon at Millbrook General Hospital, who specializes in sports medicine for professional athletes. We'd been married for 11 years, together for 14, and from every external perspective, we were the golden couple of our social circle. I was the sharp, successful career woman who could analyze complex financial crimes during the day and then host elegant dinner parties that left our guests talking for weeks. James was the brilliant, compassionate doctor who saved careers and changed lives, whose warm laugh could fill a room and whose dedication to his patients was genuinely inspiring. Our home at 2847 Rosewood Manor Drive was a stunning colonial revival with soaring ceilings, custom millwork, and formal gardens that I'd spent 3 years perfecting. It was the kind of house where important people felt comfortable discussing important things, where James could entertain the hospital board members and where I could host the partners from my firm. We had what everyone wanted: successful careers, financial security, a beautiful home, and a marriage that seemed unshakable. We traveled to medical conferences in Barcelona and forensic accounting seminars in London. We spent our weekends antiquing in Litchfield County or attending charity galas in Hartford. We were the couple that other couples looked at and wondered what their secret was. Our friends envied us. Our families held us up as the standard of what marriage could be when 2 ambitious, intelligent people chose to build something together. We'd weathered the usual challenges that ambitious couples face: competing work schedules, the stress of demanding careers, the gradual realization that children might not be in our future due to my endometriosis. Through all of it, we'd seemed to emerge stronger, more connected, more committed to the life we'd built together. What I didn't understand until 4 months ago was that while I'd been perfecting our life, James had been constructing an entirely separate one. And Rachel Montgomery, the woman who would sit at my dinner table with such maddening confidence, was the architect of that alternate reality. Tonight, as she sits across from me wearing a black silk dress that probably costs more than most people's monthly mortgage, laughing at James's stories and playing the role of the charming family friend, she has no idea that I know exactly who she really is. She doesn't know that I've spent the last 16 weeks methodically documenting every lie, every secret meeting, every stolen moment that she and my husband thought they'd hidden so cleverly. She doesn't know that the dinner party she thinks is a routine social gathering is actually the most carefully orchestrated exposure of adultery that our wealthy suburban community has ever witnessed. And she certainly doesn't know that her own husband, Dr. Michael Montgomery, is currently parking his Mercedes in my driveway, believing he's arriving for a surprise anniversary celebration that I supposedly organized to honor his and Rachel's 5 years of marriage. In 38 minutes, maybe 37 now, Michael is going to walk through that front door carrying 24 red roses and a bottle of Dom Perignon, expecting to surprise his beloved wife. Instead, he's going to discover that the woman he's spent 5 years adoring has been systematically destroying my marriage while simultaneously lying to him about everything from her work schedule to her weekend shopping trips. This is the story of how one dinner party, 8 guests, and months of careful planning became the night that justice was served with the main course, and how 2 unfaithful spouses learned that some games are more dangerous than they ever imagined. But first, you need to understand exactly how I discovered that my perfect life was built on a foundation of lies that would have impressed even the most creative financial fraudsters I'd ever investigated. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. Before everything unraveled in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, my life in Millbrook Heights was everything I'd worked toward since graduating summa cum laude from Yale with my master's in forensic accounting. James and I had built what everyone in our circle considered the gold standard of professional marriages. 2 highly educated, ambitious people who'd managed to create something beautiful together without sacrificing their individual success. Our story began 15 years ago at a medical conference in Boston, where I was consulting on a healthcare fraud case, and James was presenting research on revolutionary arthroscopic techniques. He was 31 then, already establishing himself as one of the most promising young orthopedic surgeons on the East Coast, with hands that could repair torn ACLs with the precision of a master craftsman and a bedside manner that made professional. Athletes trust him with career-defining procedures. I was 28. 3 years into my career at what would become Pemberton and Associates, building a reputation as the forensic accountant who could find financial deceptions that others missed entirely. Insurance companies flew me across the country to investigate suspicious claims. Law firms retained me to untangle complex embezzlement schemes. The FBI consulted with me on white-collar cases that involved millions in hidden assets. We met during the cocktail hour when James approached me at the bar, not with a pickup line, but with genuine curiosity about how forensic accounting worked in healthcare fraud cases. He'd been following a case in the news where a medical equipment company had been overbilling Medicare, and he wanted to understand how investigators traced the money through shell companies and overseas accounts. Most men were either intimidated by my profession or assumed it was boring. James was fascinated. He asked intelligent questions, understood the complexity of what I did, and seemed genuinely impressed by the detective work involved in following financial trails. By the end of that evening, we'd moved our conversation to a quiet corner booth where he was sketching surgical procedures on cocktail napkins while I explained how money laundering schemes worked. Our courtship was unconventional, but perfect for 2 people who lived demanding professional lives. James would call me between surgeries to hear about the latest case I was working on. I'd drive up to Hartford on weekends to watch him perform procedures when he had particularly interesting cases. We'd spend hours discussing the psychology of deception, how people convinced themselves they could get away with elaborate lies, whether in financial fraud or medical malpractice. 3 years later, James proposed during a weekend getaway to Martha's Vineyard, not with a traditional romantic dinner, but during a morning walk on the beach where he told me that I was the only person who'd ever understood both his ambition and his need for intellectual partnership. The ring was a stunning 2-carat emerald-cut diamond that he'd chosen because it reminded him of my analytical mind, clear, brilliant, and impossible to fake. Our wedding at the Millbrook Country Club was featured in Connecticut Magazine as one of the year's most elegant celebrations. 200 guests, including hospital administrators, federal judges, and senior partners from major accounting firms. James's medical school roommates served as groomsmen, while my sorority sisters from Yale flew in from across the country to be my bridesmaids. We honeymooned in Switzerland, where James attended a conference on sports medicine innovations while I toured the famous Swiss banking centers that had featured in several of my most complex international fraud cases. It was perfectly us, combining personal pleasure with professional development, supporting each other's careers while creating memories that belonged entirely to our relationship. The house on Rosewood Manor Drive came 2 years after our wedding, when both our careers had reached points where we could afford something truly special. James had just been named chief of sports medicine at Millbrook General, while I'd made senior partner at Pemberton and Associates after successfully recovering $37 million in a pharmaceutical fraud case that had made national headlines. The house was a 1920s colonial revival that had been meticulously restored by the previous owners, complete with original hardwood floors, hand-carved crown molding, and a master suite that James converted into a home office where he could review surgical films and patient charts. I claimed the sunroom as my workspace, surrounding myself with filing cabinets, computer monitors, and whiteboards where I could map out complex financial schemes. We entertained regularly and well. Monthly dinner parties for James's colleagues, from the hospital, quarterly gatherings for my firm's partners and their spouses, annual holiday celebrations that drew guests from both our professional and personal circles. I became known for my attention to detail, perfectly coordinated table settings, seasonal menus that accommodated every dietary restriction, wine pairings that impressed even the most sophisticated palates. James was the consummate host, charming, and engaging with everyone from hospital board members to the young residents he mentored. He had a gift for making people feel special, remembering personal details about their families, their hobbies, their concerns. Guests would often comment that they'd never felt more welcomed anywhere than at our dinner table. Our marriage seemed to embody everything that modern professional couples aspired to achieve. We supported each other's demanding careers without resentment. We maintained our individual identities while building something stronger together. We handled stress well, communicated effectively, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company even after 11 years of marriage. We traveled internationally for conferences and pleasure. We invested wisely in art, real estate, and retirement accounts. We maintained close friendships with other successful couples who shared our values and interests. We contributed to charities, mentored younger professionals, and served on boards that mattered to our community. From every external measure, Victoria and James Ashford were living the American dream at its most refined level. We had achieved financial security, professional recognition, social standing, and a marriage that others held up as a model of what partnership could accomplish. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined despite my professional expertise in uncovering deception, was that James had been systematically constructing a parallel life that made my most complex fraud cases look simple by comparison. And Rachel Montgomery, the woman who would soon be sitting across from me with such dangerous confidence, was the co-conspirator in the most elaborate betrayal I'd ever encountered. Looking back now, I realized the irony was almost poetic. My entire career was built on my ability to spot inconsistencies, to notice when numbers didn't add up, to identify patterns that revealed deception hiding beneath carefully constructed facades. I could spend 6 months analyzing thousands of financial transactions and find the single anomaly that exposed a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. I could review corporate expense reports and immediately identify which receipts were fabricated and which business trips never actually happened. At Pemberton and Associates, I was legendary for my attention to detail. My colleagues would joke that I could spot a fraudulent invoice from across the room, that I had some kind of supernatural ability to sense when people were lying about money. Senior partners would assign me their most complex cases because they knew I'd find connections that others would miss, uncover evidence that seemed impossible to detect. I'd successfully exposed pharmaceutical executives who'd been inflating research costs for years. I'd traced hidden assets through 12 different offshore accounts to recover funds for bankruptcy courts. I'd testified as an expert witness in federal cases where my analysis had sent white-collar criminals to prison. For decades, the FBI had me on speed dial for cases involving sophisticated financial fraud. My methodical approach to investigation was what set me apart from other forensic accountants. I never relied on hunches or assumptions. I built cases brick by brick, document by document, creating timelines and cross-referencing data until the truth became undeniable. I'd learned early in my career that emotional responses clouded judgment, so I'd trained myself to approach every case with clinical detachment. In my personal life, this same analytical nature made me an exceptionally organized wife and hostess. I kept detailed calendars tracking James's surgery schedules, hospital commitments, and conference travel. I maintained comprehensive files on our social circle, dietary preferences, anniversary dates, children's birthdays, professional achievements, worth celebrating. I planned our dinner parties months in advance, creating spreadsheets that tracked guest lists, menu selections, wine pairings, and seasonal decorations. James often marveled at my ability to juggle complex professional cases while maintaining our social calendar and household management with military precision. He'd tell colleagues that I was the most organized person he'd ever met, that I could probably run a small country with the same efficiency I brought to planning our annual holiday party. My colleagues at the firm appreciated my reliability in different ways. When they needed someone to review contracts for hidden clauses, they called me. When clients required detailed asset searches, they assigned me. When federal prosecutors needed expert testimony that could withstand aggressive cross-examination, they requested me specifically. I'd built my reputation on being the person who never missed crucial details. But here's what makes this story so devastatingly ironic. While I was perfecting my ability to detect financial deception in strangers, I was completely blind to the emotional deception happening in my own home. The same analytical skills that made me exceptional at uncovering fraud seemed to shut down entirely when it came to my marriage. Maybe it was because I loved James so completely that I couldn't imagine him capable of systematic deception. Maybe it was because our relationship had always been built on intellectual honesty and mutual respect that I couldn't conceive of him constructing elaborate lies. Maybe it was because I'd seen him interact with patients and colleagues for 11 years, witnessing his genuine compassion and integrity, that the possibility of betrayal seemed impossible. Or maybe it was because James understood my professional skills well enough to construct his deception specifically to avoid triggering my analytical instincts. He knew I could spot financial irregularities, so he was careful never to create obvious money trails. He knew I noticed timeline inconsistencies, so he built his lies around his unpredictable surgery schedule. He knew I analyzed behavior patterns, so he maintained just enough normalcy to avoid raising red flags. The truth is, I'd become so focused on being the perfect wife and hostess that I'd stopped applying my professional skepticism to my personal life. I trusted James completely, which meant I accepted his explanations for everything without the kind of verification I'd demand in any professional context. When he started working later at the hospital, I didn't call to confirm his schedule with his assistant. When he began traveling more frequently to medical conferences, I didn't verify his registration or hotel bookings. When he claimed emergency surgeries were keeping him out past midnight, I didn't question why his scrubs never seemed particularly rumpled or why he never smelled like the antiseptic that typically clung to him after long procedures. I'd created elaborate blind spots in my own analytical abilities because I'd convinced myself that applying professional skepticism to my marriage would be a betrayal of trust. I told myself that a healthy relationship required faith, not investigation. I'd believed that love meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, not demanding evidence for every claim. This fundamental disconnect between my professional and personal judgment would prove to be the most expensive mistake of my life. While I was helping federal prosecutors send embezzlers to prison, my own husband was embezzling from our marriage, stealing time, emotional intimacy, and honest communication to invest in a relationship that made a mockery of everything I thought we'd built together. The woman who could trace millions of dollars through complex international money laundering schemes couldn't see that her husband was laundering his affection through an elaborate system of lies and misdirection. The investigator who could identify fraudulent documents with a single glance couldn't recognize that her husband's stories about his daily activities were fiction more creative than most novels. But here's what James didn't understand about my analytical nature. Once I finally started asking the right questions, once my professional instincts finally overcame my personal blind spots, I would bring the same methodical thoroughness to investigating his betrayal that I brought to my most complex fraud cases. And once I discovered the truth, I would use every skill I'd developed over 15 years of forensic accounting to ensure that justice was served with the same precision I brought to exposing corporate criminals. The same attention to detail that had made me exceptional at uncovering financial fraud would make me absolutely devastating at orchestrating the perfect revelation of marital deception. James had made one critical error in his risk assessment. He'd forgotten that his wife was someone who specialized in making sure that people who thought they were too clever to get caught learned exactly how wrong they were. The changes began so gradually that I convinced myself they were natural evolution in a long marriage. After 11 years together, it seemed reasonable that our routines would shift, that James's career demands would intensify, that we'd settle into more independent rhythms. What I didn't recognize at the time was that I was witnessing the careful implementation of a deception strategy sophisticated enough to impress the white-collar criminals I'd spent my career pursuing. It started with James's surgery schedule, becoming increasingly unpredictable. For the first 9 years of our marriage, his operating days had followed relatively consistent patterns. Tuesdays and Thursdays were typically his heaviest surgical days, with Mondays reserved for consultations, and Fridays for follow-up appointments. Weekend emergencies were genuinely rare unless he was on trauma call, which happened roughly once every 6 weeks. But about 8 months ago, James began mentioning last-minute surgeries with increasing frequency. Emergency procedures that required him to stay at the hospital until 10 or 11 at night. Complex cases that demanded his immediate attention on Saturday mornings. Surgical consultations that somehow required his presence at odd hours when other doctors would typically handle routine coverage. I should have questioned why a sports medicine specialist was suddenly dealing with so many emergency cases. Athletes rarely require middle-of-the-night surgery unless they're dealing with traumatic injuries, and those cases would typically go to trauma surgeons, not specialists like James. But I'd grown so accustomed to trusting his professional judgment that I accepted his explanations without analysis. The travel began increasing around the same time. James had always attended medical conferences. It was essential for maintaining his board certification and staying current with advances in sports medicine. But suddenly, there were conferences I'd never heard of, in cities that seemed unlikely, venues for major orthopedic gatherings, weekend seminars in Albany, 3-day workshops in Burlington, educational symposiums in Providence that required him to leave Friday afternoon and return late Sunday evening. When I suggested joining him for a few of these trips, turning them into romantic getaways like we'd done in the past, James always had reasonable explanations for why that wouldn't work. The conferences were too intensive, requiring his complete focus. The venues were in remote locations without decent accommodations for spouses. The schedules were too demanding to allow for any personal time together. I found myself eating dinner alone 3 or 4 nights a week, something that had never happened in our marriage previously. James would text around 6:30, apologizing for another unexpected delay, suggesting I go ahead and eat without him. He'd arrive home after 9, claiming he'd grabbed something quick at the hospital cafeteria, too exhausted to discuss his day in any detail. Our weekend routines, which had been sacred throughout our marriage, began disintegrating as well. Saturday. Morning antiquing trips became impossible because James needed to review surgical films or catch up on patient notes. Sunday brunches with friends were repeatedly canceled because emergency cases required his immediate attention. Our traditional Sunday evening meal preparation, where we'd cook elaborate dinners together while discussing our upcoming week, became solo affairs as James fielded urgent phone calls or reviewed complex cases that somehow couldn't wait until Monday. The physical changes were subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd been married to the same man for 11 years. James began showering immediately upon arriving home, claiming that hospital environments made him feel contaminated, and he needed to wash away the antiseptic smell before he could relax. This was new behavior. For years, he'd typically changed clothes and unwound with a glass of wine before eventually showering later in the evening. His grooming habits shifted in ways that seemed insignificant individually, but created a pattern when viewed collectively. He started using a different cologne, something more expensive and sophisticated than the subtle fragrance he'd worn for years. His hair appointments became more frequent, moving from every 6 weeks to every 4 weeks, often scheduled during weekday lunch breaks rather than weekend convenience. James began paying more attention to his wardrobe in ways that seemed professional but felt somehow different. He purchased several new suits, claiming his existing ones looked dated when meeting with prominent athletes and their agents. He bought expensive ties, upgraded his watch, and started carrying a different briefcase, leather instead of the practical, nylon case he'd used throughout our marriage. The technology changes should have triggered my professional suspicions immediately. James became protective of his phone in ways that violated our usual patterns of casual digital sharing. For years, we'd used each other's phones interchangeably, checking messages when the other was driving, answering calls when someone was in the shower, sharing photos and calendar updates without thinking twice about privacy. Suddenly, James's phone was always face down during dinner. He'd take it with him to the bathroom, something he'd never done previously. When it buzzed during our conversations, he'd glance at it with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not annoyance at being interrupted, but something closer to anticipation mixed with anxiety. His computer habits changed as well. James had always been casual about leaving his laptop open around the house, often asking me to check his email or calendar when he was busy with other tasks. But he began closing it whenever he left the room, password-protecting files that had never been secured before, and spending unusual amounts of time on what he claimed were research projects that required intensive focus. The credit card statements began showing charges that didn't align with our usual spending patterns. Restaurants in Hartford that James claimed were convenient spots for meeting with colleagues between hospital shifts. Gas purchases in towns where he supposedly attended. Those weekend conferences. Hotel charges that seemed excessive for the modest accommodations he typically chose for professional travel. When I asked about these expenses during our monthly financial review, a practice we'd maintained throughout our marriage to ensure we were meeting our savings goals, James provided explanations that were detailed enough to sound credible, but vague enough to avoid verification. Professional dinners with visiting colleagues, networking events that required upgraded accommodations, conference fees that included premium meal packages. Most devastating of all were the emotional changes that I couldn't quantify but felt in every interaction. James became distant in ways that were almost imperceptible, still affectionate, still attentive, still the charming man I'd married, but somehow performing these behaviors rather than feeling them naturally. Our conversations became more superficial, focused on logistics and schedules rather than the deeper intellectual connection that had always defined our relationship. The man who had once been genuinely curious about my forensic accounting cases began offering distracted responses when I shared details about my work. The husband who had previously remembered every detail about my complex investigations started forgetting basic facts about cases I'd mentioned multiple times. The partner who had once engaged in lengthy discussions about human psychology and deception began changing the subject whenever I brought up professional insights about how people justify betraying trust. I told myself these changes reflected natural evolution in a mature marriage, the kind of settling that happens when two people become completely comfortable with each other. I convinced myself that James's increased focus on his career was admirable ambition, that his need for personal space reflected healthy independence, that his distraction during our conversations simply meant he was processing important professional challenges. But deep in my analytical mind, the same instincts that had made me exceptional at detecting fraud were registering patterns that didn't align with the explanations I was accepting. I was seeing anomalies that would have triggered immediate investigation in any professional context, but I was choosing to explain them away because the alternative was too devastating to consider. What I didn't understand yet was that James wasn't just changing, he was systematically creating the infrastructure necessary to maintain a double life. Every modification to his routine, every new habit, every altered behavior was a carefully calculated component of a deception strategy that would have impressed the most sophisticated financial criminals I'd ever investigated. The moment that shattered my willful ignorance came on a Tuesday evening in October, during what should have been a routine domestic task that I'd performed countless times throughout our marriage. I was in our master bedroom, preparing James's clothes for his upcoming weekend conference in Burlington, or what I believed was a conference in Burlington, when I discovered something that made every rational explanation I'd been constructing collapse like a house of cards. James was downstairs in his home office, supposedly reviewing surgical notes for the following day's procedures, while I methodically went through his garments to ensure he had everything needed for what he'd described as an intensive 3-day orthopedic symposium. I'd been handling this kind of travel preparation for years, taking pride in my attention to detail and my ability to anticipate his needs before he even realized what he'd forgotten to pack. As I reached into the inner pocket of his navy blazer, the one he'd worn to dinner with hospital administrators the previous week, my fingers encountered something that didn't belong. Not a business card or conference program or any of the usual professional debris that accumulated in his pockets, but a small, expensive piece of paper that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a hotel keycard holder from the Grandview Resort and Spa, an exclusive retreat about 90 minutes north of Millbrook Heights. The kind of place that catered to wealthy couples seeking romantic weekends, not medical professionals attending educational conferences. The kind of establishment that charged $800 per night for suites with private balconies, overlooking mountain vistas and in-room jacuzzis designed for intimate relaxation. But it wasn't the location that made my hands start trembling as I stared at that innocent-looking piece of cardboard. It was the date stamped on the keycard holder, 3 weeks earlier, on a weekend when James had supposedly been attending a surgical techniques workshop in Albany. A weekend when he'd called me Saturday evening to complain about the cramped hotel, room and subpar conference facilities, describing accommodations that were apparently so disappointing that he'd considered driving home early. Inside the keycard holder, folded with the kind of careful precision that suggested it had been treasured rather than carelessly stuffed into a pocket, was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. The paper was cream-colored with a subtle watermark, the kind of luxury writing material that cost more per sheet than most people spent on entire boxes of cards. The handwriting was distinctly feminine, flowing and elegant in a way that spoke of private school education and careful attention to presentation. but it was the words themselves that made my entire world tilt sideways. My dearest James, last weekend was absolutely magical. I keep replaying every moment we shared. The sunrise from our balcony, the champagne by the fireplace, the way you made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. I can't wait until we can finally stop hiding and build the life we've been dreaming about. All my love always, Rachel. I read those words 3 times before my analytical mind could process their implications. This wasn't a casual flirtation or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was evidence of an ongoing relationship, complete with romantic getaways, future planning, and the kind of emotional intimacy that should have belonged exclusively to our marriage. Someone named Rachel was apparently so confident in her place in James's life that she was already envisioning a future where they didn't need to hide their relationship. My forensic accounting training kicked in automatically, the same methodical approach I'd used to analyze thousands of financial crimes over the past 15 years. I photographed the note and keycard holder with my phone, documenting the evidence before carefully replacing everything exactly as I'd found it. James couldn't know that I'd discovered his secret, not until I'd had time to determine the full scope of his deception. But even as my professional instincts took control, the emotional impact was devastating in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. This wasn't just infidelity, it was systematic betrayal that had been carefully constructed over months, possibly years. James hadn't made a mistake or succumbed to a moment of weakness. He'd built an entire parallel life with someone who clearly believed she had a legitimate claim to his future. The woman who'd written that note wasn't some random affair partner who understood her place as a temporary distraction. She was someone who expected to transition from secret lover to legitimate partner, someone who'd been promised enough to believe that my marriage was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a permanent boundary to respect. I spent the next hour sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by James's clothes and conference materials, trying to reconcile the evidence in my hands with everything I'd believed about my husband and our marriage. The man who'd been lying to me about weekend conferences was the same person who'd held my hand through 3 miscarriages, who'd celebrated every promotion in my career, who'd spent 11 years building what I'd believed was an unshakable partnership. The betrayal was so complete, so thoroughly planned, that it forced me to question every interaction we'd had over the past year. How many of his supposed emergency surgeries had actually been romantic dinners with Rachel? How many weekend conferences had been intimate getaways to luxury resorts? How many late nights at the hospital had been spent in someone else's bed, planning a future that didn't include me? But alongside the devastation came something unexpected, a cold, analytical fury that felt familiar from my most challenging professional cases. The same part of my mind that had helped me expose elaborate financial fraud schemes was already beginning to formulate questions that needed answers. Who was Rachel? How long had this been going on? What promises had James made to her? What lies had he told about our marriage to justify his betrayal? As I carefully returned James's clothes to their hangers and restored our bedroom to its previous state, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I wasn't going to confront James immediately, and I wasn't going to collapse into the kind of emotional breakdown that might give him the opportunity to control the narrative or minimize his deception. Instead, I was going to investigate this betrayal with the same systematic thoroughness I brought to my most complex fraud cases. I was going to uncover every detail of James's relationship with Rachel, document every lie he'd told, and gather enough evidence to ensure that when the truth finally emerged, there would be no possibility of denial, manipulation, or half-hearted explanations. The woman who'd built her career on exposing people who thought they were too clever to get caught was about to turn those same skills on the most important case of her life. James had made a critical error in underestimating my professional capabilities. He'd forgotten that his wife specialized in methodically destroying people who believed their deception was too sophisticated to unravel. The investigation was about To begin, and this time, the stakes weren't just financial recovery or professional satisfaction. This time, I was fighting for the truth about my own life, and I intended to win with devastating completeness. Rachel, whoever she was, had no idea that her carefully written love note had just triggered the most thorough investigation of deception that either she or James would ever experience. The game had changed completely, and they didn't even know they were now playing against someone who'd never lost a case in 15 years of professional fraud detection. The transformation from devastated wife to methodical investigator happened with the same precision I brought to my most complex fraud cases. That Tuesday night, after carefully documenting Rachel's note and returning everything to its original position, I sat in my home office until 3 a.m, creating the framework for what would become the most thorough investigation of my career. My first step was establishing a secure digital environment where I could conduct research without leaving traces on our shared household computers or devices. I drove to Best Buy the following morning and purchased a laptop with cash, setting up completely separate email accounts and cloud storage systems that James would never discover. The same techniques I used to protect sensitive client information would now shield my investigation from the man who'd been systematically lying to me for months. Rachel's full identity became my initial priority. With only a first name and the evidence of expensive taste, suggested by her stationery and choice of luxury resorts, I began the kind of systematic background research that had made me legendary among my colleagues at Pemberton and Associates. If she was involved with James, she likely moved in similar, professional or social circles, which meant I could trace her through the interconnected networks of Millbrook Heights' affluent community. I started with the Grandview Resort and Spa's website, researching their guest services and event calendar to understand what kind of clientele they attracted. The resort specialized in romantic getaways for wealthy professionals, offering packages that included couples spa treatments, private dining experiences, and weekend retreat programs. Their guest testimonials featured photos of attractive couples, celebrating anniversaries, engagements, and what the website euphemistically called relationship renewal experiences. The resort's social media presence provided my first real breakthrough. Their Instagram account regularly featured guest photos, tagged with permission, showing happy couples enjoying various amenities. I spent hours scrolling through months of posts, looking for any images that might include James or provide clues about Rachel's identity. 3 weeks into my investigation, I found what I was looking for. A photo from mid-September showed a group of guests at the resort's wine tasting event, and in the background, partially obscured by other attendees, was a woman whose profile matched the elegant handwriting I'd seen in that devastating note. She was stunning in the way that successful, well-maintained women in their early 30s could be, perfectly styled auburn hair, expensive jewelry, and the kind of confident posture that suggested someone accustomed to attention and admiration. But it was her companion that made my stomach clench with recognition. James stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back, his expression more relaxed and genuinely happy than I'd seen him look in months. They weren't trying to hide their intimacy. They were simply unaware they were being photographed for the resort's promotional materials. The photo's metadata revealed it had been taken on a weekend when James claimed to be attending a continuing education seminar in Hartford. According to my meticulous records, he'd called me that Saturday evening to complain about the quality of the hotel restaurant and boring lectures on advances in arthroscopic surgery. While he was supposedly enduring subpar conference food, he'd actually been enjoying a wine tasting with his mistress at one of New England's most exclusive romantic retreats. My forensic accounting skills made identifying Rachel surprisingly straightforward once I had her photograph. I enhanced the image using professional software, focusing on distinctive jewelry and clothing details that suggested specific brands and price points. Her watch was a Cartier tank, her earrings appeared to be Tiffany & Co., and her cashmere wrap looked like something from Brunello Cucinelli's latest collection. These weren't impulse purchases or gifts from an admirer. They represented the kind of sustained luxury spending that suggested serious personal wealth or a very generous benefactor. Either Rachel had independent means that allowed her to afford these items, or James had been more financially generous with his mistress than I'd realized from reviewing our credit card statements. The breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the resort's guest registry with membership lists from exclusive clubs and organizations in the greater Hartford area. Using professional databases I accessed through my firm's research accounts, I began building a profile of women named Rachel who moved in circles where they might encounter a successful orthopedic surgeon. Rachel Montgomery's name appeared on the membership roster of the Millbrook Tennis Club, the same exclusive facility where James played twice weekly and where we'd attended numerous social events over the years. She was also listed as a patron supporter of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra, an organization that hosted annual galas where medical professionals frequently purchased tables for networking and social purposes. But the detail that made everything click into place was her professional listing in the Connecticut Medical Directory. Rachel Montgomery, physical therapist, specialized in sports medicine rehabilitation, with a practice that focused on treating professional athletes and high-performance individuals recovering from orthopedic procedures. The professional connection explained everything while making the betrayal infinitely more devastating. Rachel wasn't some random woman James had met at a bar or social event. She was a colleague whose work complemented his own, someone he would have encountered regularly, through patient referrals and professional consultations. Their relationship had the perfect cover of legitimate medical collaboration, while providing endless opportunities for private meetings disguised as professional necessity. Over the following weeks, I used every investigative technique I'd mastered during 15 years of forensic accounting to build a comprehensive understanding of James and Rachel's relationship. I traced their communication patterns through telecommunications records, mapped their travel schedules using hotel and restaurant reservations, and documented their financial interactions through credit card analyses that revealed a pattern of coordinated spending. The scope of their deception was breathtaking in its sophistication. They'd been careful to avoid obvious digital trails, communicating through encrypted messaging apps and meeting at locations that wouldn't immediately connect them to each other. James had been funding their relationship through cash advances and prepaid cards that wouldn't appear on our joint statements, while Rachel had been equally careful to avoid creating obvious evidence of their involvement. But their very carefulness created patterns that my trained eye could recognize and analyze. The timing of James's cash withdrawals corresponded perfectly with Rachel's social media posts from expensive restaurants and weekend destinations. His conference travel aligned with her vacation photos from the same luxury resorts. His emergency surgery schedules matched her availability as determined by her professional appointment calendar. Most damaging of all was the evidence I uncovered about their future planning. Rachel had been quietly dissolving her professional partnerships and reducing her patient load, preparing for what seemed to be a significant life change. James had been researching real estate opportunities in other states, ostensibly for investment purposes, but with a focus on areas where Rachel had family connections. The investigation revealed that my husband hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been methodically preparing to abandon our marriage for a completely different life, with a woman who believed she was his true partner. The weekend at Grandview Resort hadn't been a guilty pleasure. It had been a reconnaissance mission for their shared future. By the time I finished gathering evidence, I had enough documentation to destroy both their personal and professional reputations completely. But simply exposing their affair wasn't sufficient justice for the elaborate deception they'd constructed. They'd both invested significant time and energy in building their secret relationship, while systematically lying to everyone who trusted them. What they deserved wasn't just exposure. They deserved the kind of precisely orchestrated humiliation that would ensure their betrayal became a cautionary tale for anyone else who thought they could construct such sophisticated deceptions. The dinner party that would ultimately destroy them both was beginning to take shape in my mind, and it would be masterful enough to make my most complex fraud investigations look simple by comparison. The plan that crystallized in my mind over The following weeks was more intricate than any fraud investigation I'd ever conducted, requiring the same methodical attention to detail, but with the added complexity of human psychology and social dynamics. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was orchestrating a revelation that would ensure maximum impact and accountability for everyone involved. The dinner party concept emerged from a conversation I overheard James having with his colleague, Dr. Patricia Henley, about their upcoming medical conference in Boston. Patricia mentioned that her husband Michael would be joining her for the weekend, turning the professional trip into a romantic getaway. The casual way she discussed combining business with pleasure sparked an idea that would become the foundation for my entire strategy. I began researching Rachel Montgomery's personal life, with the same systematic thoroughness I brought to analyzing corporate financial structures. Through carefully crafted social media investigation and professional networking searches, I discovered that Rachel was married to Dr. Michael Montgomery, a successful cardiologist at Hartford General Hospital. More importantly, their fifth wedding anniversary was approaching in November, and Rachel had been posting increasingly elaborate hints about expecting something special to commemorate the milestone. The irony was perfect and devastating. While Rachel was having an affair with my husband, she was simultaneously maintaining the facade of a loving wife who expected her own husband to celebrate their marriage with romantic gestures and expensive gifts. The woman who was actively destroying my marriage was apparently confident that her own remained secure and worthy of celebration. Michael Montgomery's professional profile revealed him to be exactly the kind of man who would be devastated by learning about his wife's betrayal. His LinkedIn showed involvement in medical ethics committees and charitable foundations focused on family services. His social media presence depicted a devoted husband who regularly posted admiring photos of Rachel at various events, always with captions that emphasized how lucky he felt to be married to such an accomplished, beautiful woman. The foundation of my plan required bringing both betrayed spouses together in a setting where the truth could emerge naturally, with sufficient witnesses to prevent any attempt at denial or damage control. But simply arranging for Michael and me to meet wouldn't create the dramatic impact I was seeking. I needed a scenario where James and Rachel would be forced to maintain their deception while simultaneously being exposed to the very people they'd been betraying. The solution came through my professional network at Pemberton & Associates. My colleague Sarah Chen mentioned that her husband David was organizing a medical ethics symposium that would bring together physicians from various specialties to discuss professional boundaries and personal integrity in healthcare settings. The symposium was scheduled for the weekend before Thanksgiving, and David was actively recruiting prominent physicians to participate in panel discussions. I volunteered to help with the event coordination, offering my organizational skills and social connections to ensure the symposium attracted influential attendees. More importantly, I used my position to influence the guest list and seating arrangements for the formal dinner that would conclude the symposium weekend. Through careful manipulation of the invitation process, I ensured that both James and Michael Montgomery received personal invitations to participate in the symposium. James's expertise in sports medicine made him a logical choice for a panel on treating high-performance athletes, while Michael's background in medical ethics qualified him perfectly for discussions about professional integrity and boundary management. The symposium dinner would be held at the Millbrook Country Club, the same venue where James and I had celebrated our wedding 11 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't accidental. I wanted our marriage to be destroyed in the same location where we'd promised to honor and cherish each other for the rest of our lives. But the symposium dinner alone wasn't sufficient for my purposes. I needed Rachel present as well, and I needed her to be completely unaware of the trap she was walking into. This required a separate but coordinated strategy that took advantage of her professional vanity and social ambitions. I created a fictional consulting opportunity through a shell company I established using techniques I'd learned during asset recovery investigations. Posing as a representative of an exclusive wellness retreat planning to expand into sports medicine rehabilitation, I approached Rachel about providing expert consultation services for their new facility design. The consultation meeting was scheduled for the same weekend as the medical symposium, with a dinner presentation that would allow Rachel to network with potential investors and medical professionals who might refer patients to her practice. I suggested she invite her husband to join her, emphasizing that the networking opportunities could benefit his cardiology practice as well. Rachel's response exceeded my expectations. She was not only enthusiastic about the consulting opportunity, but also eager to use the dinner as a chance to showcase her expertise and social connections. She even asked if she could suggest additional attendees who might be interested in the wellness retreat concept, giving me the perfect opening to mention that Dr. James Ashford would be present as a potential investor. The pieces were falling into place with satisfying precision. James would attend the symposium dinner believing it was a routine professional obligation. Michael would join his wife thinking he was supporting her business development while expanding his own professional network. Rachel would arrive confident that she was participating in a lucrative consulting opportunity that would advance her career. None of them would realize that they were walking into the most carefully orchestrated exposure of adultery in Millbrook Heights history, witnessed by dozens of prominent physicians who would ensure that the fallout extended far beyond personal embarrassment into professional consequences. But arranging the guest list was only the beginning of my preparation. I needed to ensure that the revelation would be undeniable and devastating, with sufficient evidence to prevent any attempt at manipulation or damage control. This required additional surveillance and documentation that would capture James and Rachel's relationship in ways that couldn't be explained away as professional collaboration or innocent friendship. I hired Elena Rodriguez, the same private investigator my colleague had used during her divorce proceedings to conduct targeted surveillance during the weeks leading up to the symposium dinner. Elena's background in law enforcement and her discretion with high-profile clients made her perfect for gathering the kind of evidence that would hold up under the scrutiny I expected to follow. Elena's investigation revealed that James and Rachel had become careless in their confidence, meeting regularly at expensive restaurants throughout Hartford, and even taking weekend trips to luxury destinations without bothering to maintain their previous operational security. Their behavior suggested they believed their deception was so sophisticated that they no longer needed to worry about detection. The final element of my plan involved carefully choreographing the evening's events to ensure maximum dramatic impact. I would need to present the evidence at precisely the right moment, with all parties present and no opportunity for escape or deflection. The timing would be crucial. Too early and James or Rachel might find ways to minimize the damage. Too late, and the other guests might leave before witnessing the complete revelation. As the symposium weekend approached, I felt the same combination of nervous energy and analytical focus that preceded my most important professional presentations. Every detail had been planned and verified, every contingency anticipated and prepared for. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were positioned perfectly, and the setting would ensure that the consequences extended far beyond the immediate emotional devastation. James and Rachel had constructed their relationship with careful attention to secrecy and security, but they'd underestimated the investigative capabilities of someone who specialized in exposing sophisticated deceptions. Their elaborate affair was about to be dissected with surgical precision in front of an audience that would ensure their betrayal became a permanent part of their professional and social legacy. The dinner party that would destroy 2 marriages and multiple careers was now less than 72 hours away, and I was ready to deliver justice with the same methodical thoroughness that had made me legendary in the forensic accounting world. The evening of the Medical Ethics Symposium dinner arrived with the crisp clarity of late November in Connecticut, the kind of night where every detail seemed sharp and defined against the backdrop of early winter. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the midnight blue silk dress I'd chosen specifically for this occasion. Elegant enough for the formal dinner, but with clean lines that suggested precision and control rather than vulnerability. My reflection showed a woman who looked composed and professional, betraying nothing of the calculated fury that had been building for weeks. The investigator who'd spent months documenting her husband's betrayal was about to execute the most important presentation of her career, and I intended to deliver it with devastating effectiveness. James had left the house 2 hours earlier, claiming he needed to review his panel notes before the symposium dinner. In reality, I knew from Elena's surveillance reports that he was meeting Rachel at the Grandview Resort for what they believed would be their final secret rendezvous before transitioning to a more open relationship. They had no idea that their romantic afternoon was being documented by professional-grade surveillance equipment that would provide the final pieces of evidence for tonight's revelation. The Millbrook Country Club buzzed with the sophisticated energy of Connecticut's medical elite gathering for what they expected to be a routine professional dinner. Distinguished physicians and their spouses filled the elegant ballroom, creating the perfect backdrop for the social catastrophe I was about to orchestrate. The irony of destroying my marriage in the same room where I'd celebrated it 11 years earlier wasn't lost on me. It felt like completing a circle that had been broken by deception and would now be closed by truth. I arrived precisely on time, positioning myself near the entrance where I could observe the other key players as they made their entrances. The seating chart I'd carefully arranged through my volunteer coordination role would ensure that all the principal characters in tonight's drama would be positioned for maximum impact when the truth emerged. Michael Montgomery arrived first, looking distinguished in his perfectly tailored black suit, his silver hair adding gravitas to his warm demeanor. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in these social circles, stopping to chat with colleagues and introducing himself to physicians he hadn't met previously. His genuine affection for his wife was evident in the way he kept checking his watch, clearly looking forward to Rachel's arrival. When I approached to introduce myself as the event coordinator, Michael's enthusiasm was both touching and heartbreaking. He thanked me profusely for organizing such an impressive gathering, mentioning how excited Rachel was about the networking opportunities and how proud he was of her professional accomplishments. The man had no idea that his beloved wife was currently in a luxury hotel suite with another woman's husband, preparing for what she believed would be their last secret meeting. James arrived 20 minutes later, and I felt a cold satisfaction watching him scan the room with barely concealed anxiety. He'd obviously expected a small, intimate dinner where he could maintain careful control over his interactions and avoid any situations that might compromise his carefully constructed deception. Instead, he found himself in a ballroom filled with influential physicians who knew both him and Michael professionally, creating exactly the kind of high-stakes social minefield I'd intended. When James spotted Michael across the room, his face went visibly pale. Even from a distance, I could see him calculating the risks of the situation, trying to determine whether their presence at the same event was coincidental or somehow connected to his relationship with Rachel. He approached me with forced casualness, asking about the guest list and expressing surprise at the unexpected attendance of certain colleagues. I responded with practiced innocence, explaining that the symposium had attracted more interest than anticipated and that several last-minute additions had been made to accommodate prominent physicians who'd requested invitations. James's discomfort was palpable, as he realized he'd lost control of the evening's social dynamics before it had even begun. Rachel's entrance 30 minutes later created the kind of subtle disruption that only people with trained observation skills would notice. She looked absolutely stunning in an emerald green dress that emphasized her auburn hair and confident bearing, but her composure cracked slightly when she spotted both James and Michael in the same room. The woman who'd been so careful about maintaining operational security suddenly found herself navigating a social situation that could expose her deception with a single careless word or gesture. I watched with professional appreciation as Rachel attempted to manage the complex dynamics of greeting her husband affectionately while avoiding any interaction with James that might suggest inappropriate familiarity. Her solution was to position herself strategically near the bar, where she could monitor both men while maintaining the appearance of casual social circulation. The dinner seating arrangement I'd orchestrated placed Michael directly across from where Rachel would sit, ensuring he'd have an unobstructed view of his wife's reactions throughout the evening. James was positioned 2 seats to Rachel's right, close enough that their body language would be obvious to observant guests, but not so close as to suggest deliberate coordination. As the first course was served, a delicate butternut squash bisque, that seemed absurdly civilized given what was about to unfold, I began the carefully scripted conversation that would lead to tonight's revelation. I started with innocent observations about the challenges of maintaining work-life balance in demanding medical careers, steering the discussion toward the importance of trust and communication in professional relationships. Michael eagerly participated in the conversation, sharing insights about how he and Rachel had navigated the complexities of dual medical careers while maintaining their strong marriage. His genuine affection for his wife was evident in every comment, making Rachel's visible discomfort increasingly apparent to anyone paying attention. James contributed minimally to the discussion, clearly trying to avoid saying anything that might create complications. But his obvious tension was beginning to attract notice from other guests, particularly when the conversation turned to the importance of professional ethics and personal integrity in medical practice. The moment I'd been planning for weeks arrived during the main course service. As servers moved around the table with herb-crusted salmon and roasted vegetables, I reached into my evening bag and withdrew the manila envelope that contained months of investigative work. The weight of that envelope represented not just evidence of betrayal, but the complete destruction of 2 marriages and multiple professional reputations. Before we continue with dessert, I announced, my voice carrying the same authority I'd used during federal court testimony, I think there's something important that everyone at this table needs to understand about professional boundaries and personal integrity. The conversation gradually quieted as guests sensed the shift in tone. Michael looked curious but unconcerned, still having no idea that his world was about to collapse. James had gone completely rigid, finally understanding that his carefully controlled evening was about to become his worst nightmare. Rachel's hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass, her composed facade cracking under the pressure of impending exposure. This evening's discussion about medical ethics seems particularly relevant, I continued, opening the envelope with deliberate precision, given that we have an excellent case study sitting right here at our table. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of servers moving discreetly around the ballroom. Every guest at our table was now focused entirely on my words, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The revelation that would destroy 2 marriages and multiple careers was about to begin, and I intended to deliver it with the same methodical thoroughness that had made me legendary in forensic accounting. Justice was finally about to be served, and it would be devastating enough to ensure that James and Rachel never forgot the consequences of their elaborate deception. The first photograph I placed on the white linen tablecloth showed James and Rachel entering the Grandview Resort together 3 hours earlier, their bodies' language unmistakably intimate as James's hand rested possessively on Rachel's lower back. The image was crystal clear, taken with professional surveillance equipment that captured every detail of their comfortable familiarity. The way Rachel leaned into James's touch, the satisfied smile on his face, the obvious ease of 2 people who'd done this many times before. Michael's fork clattered against his plate as he stared at the photograph, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror in the span of seconds. "I don't understand," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the gentle dinner conversation continuing at nearby tables. "Rachel told me she was meeting with potential investors this afternoon." "She was meeting with someone," I replied, my voice steady and clinical. "But not investors." I placed the second photograph beside the first, James and Rachel in an intimate embrace on the resort's private balcony, their faces turned toward each other with the kind of tender attention that spoke of deep emotional connection, rather than casual physical attraction. Rachel had gone completely white, her emerald dress suddenly making her look pale and ill. "Victoria, please," she whispered, her composed facade crumbling entirely. "You don't understand the situation." "Actually, I understand it perfectly," I said, continuing to arrange evidence across the table with the same methodical precision I'd used during federal court presentations. "I've spent 4 months investigating every detail of your relationship with my husband. Would you like me to explain exactly what I've discovered?" James finally found his voice, though it came out strained and desperate. "Victoria, this isn't the place for this conversation. We should discuss this privately." "Privately?" I looked at him with the kind of cold analysis I'd perfected during hostile witness examinations. "You mean the way you've been discussing your relationship with Rachel privately for the past 14 months? The way you've been planning your future together privately while lying to both your spouses about weekend conferences and medical emergencies?" The other guests at our table had fallen completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a routine social dinner. Dr. Patricia Henley, the symposium organizer, looked torn between professional concern and obvious fascination. The other physicians and their spouses were leaning forward slightly, drawn into the unfolding drama despite their discomfort with the public nature of the revelation. I continued placing evidence on the table, each item selected for maximum impact. Hotel receipts from weekend getaways that corresponded with James's supposed medical conferences. Restaurant bills from intimate dinners charged to credit cards that Michael had never seen. Jewelry store receipts for expensive items that had never appeared in our home but which Rachel wore regularly in her social media posts. 14 months, I repeated, ensuring that everyone at the table understood the scope of the deception. Not a momentary lapse in judgment or a brief affair that got out of hand. A systematically planned relationship that involved elaborate lies, financial deception, and the complete betrayal of 2 marriages. Michael was studying the evidence with the same analytical focus he probably brought to complex cardiac cases, his professional training helping him process information even as his personal world collapsed. "The conferences," he said slowly. "All those weekend medical conferences you've been attending lately, they weren't real." "Some were real," Rachel said desperately, finally finding her voice. "I mean, I did attend some legitimate professional events. This isn't what it looks like." I placed another photograph on the table, James and Rachel kissing passionately in the parking lot of an expensive Hartford restaurant, completely oblivious to surveillance. "What exactly does it look like, Rachel? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you and my husband have been conducting a sophisticated affair while lying to everyone who trusted you." The conversation at nearby tables had begun to quiet as other guests sensed the drama unfolding in our section. Distinguished physicians and their spouses were turning slightly in their chairs, trying to discreetly observe what was clearly becoming a spectacular social catastrophe. The very public nature of the revelation was ensuring that the consequences would extend far beyond personal humiliation into professional ramifications. James made one final attempt at damage control, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with difficult patience. "Everyone, please. This is a misunderstanding that's gotten completely out of hand. Victoria has misinterpreted some perfectly innocent professional interactions." "Professional interactions?" I opened my phone and began reading from the text messages Elena's technical surveillance had recovered. Quote, "I can't wait until we can finally be together openly. These secret meetings are killing me, but knowing we'll have forever makes it all worthwhile." End quote. That message was sent from your phone to Rachel's number last Tuesday afternoon. Michael's hands were shaking as he reached for his wine glass, the successful cardiologist who saved lives daily, struggling to process the complete destruction of his personal life. 5 years of marriage, he said, as if talking to himself. 5 years of believing we were building something real together. You were building something real, I said, my voice softening slightly with genuine sympathy for this man whose only crime had been trusting his wife. But Rachel was simultaneously building something else entirely. Rachel finally broke completely, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face as she realized that her elaborate deception had been not just discovered, but meticulously documented. I never meant for it to happen this way, she sobbed. James and we fell in love. We couldn't help ourselves. Couldn't help yourselves? The cold fury I'd been controlling for months finally broke through my professional composure. You couldn't help lying to your husband about weekend conferences. That didn't exist? You couldn't help stealing money from our joint accounts to fund romantic getaways? You couldn't help planning a future together while pretending to be faithful wives? The entire ballroom had essentially stopped functioning as a dinner party, with guests at every table now openly staring at the spectacular destruction unfolding at ours. Cell phones were discreetly appearing as people began documenting what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about social event in Millbrook Heights: history. Dr. Patricia Henley finally intervened, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing medical crises. Perhaps we should move this conversation to a private setting, she suggested diplomatically. No, Michael said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in his voice. If my wife has been conducting a public affair with Dr. Ashford, then the consequences should be equally public. I want everyone here to understand exactly what kind of people they've been associating with. James made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative, standing from his chair with the kind of commanding presence that usually worked in professional settings. I think everyone needs to calm down and approach this situation rationally. Emotions are running high, and people are saying things they'll regret. The only thing I regret, I said, standing to face him directly, is wasting 11 years of my life trusting someone who was capable of this level of systematic deception. But I don't regret exposing the truth, and I don't regret ensuring that everyone who needs to know about your character understands exactly who you really are. The revelation was complete, the evidence overwhelming, and the consequences beginning to cascade through the room like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The sophisticated medical professionals who'd gathered for a routine ethics symposium had instead witnessed the most public destruction of 2 marriages in Connecticut medical community history. But the immediate shock was only the beginning. As guests began reaching for their phones and whispering to each other about what they'd just witnessed, I realized that the true consequences of James and Rachel's betrayal were only starting to unfold. The dinner party revelation was just the opening move in a much larger game of professional and social accountability that would reshape their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. 6 months have passed since that devastating November evening at the Millbrook Country Club, and I'm sitting in my new penthouse apartment overlooking Hartford's skyline, watching the sunset paint the Connecticut River in shades of gold and amber. The view from here is breathtaking. A panoramic vista that stretches across 3 counties and reminds me daily that my life has expanded in ways I never could have imagined when I was trapped in the suffocating deception of my marriage to James. This apartment is everything my life with James wasn't. Honest, uncomplicated, and entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every decision about how to arrange my space has been made by me, for me, without having to consider anyone else's hidden agendas or secret preferences. The freedom of that authenticity is still intoxicating after years of unknowingly living a lie. The aftermath of that dinner party was swift and brutal, like watching a controlled demolition that destroyed multiple structures simultaneously. Within hours of the symposium dinner, videos and photos of the revelation had spread throughout Connecticut's medical community, via social media and professional networks. Distinguished physicians who'd witnessed the spectacular exposure of James and Rachel's affair became inadvertent broadcasters of their professional destruction. James's career imploded with devastating speed. The hospital board at Millbrook General launched an immediate investigation into his professional conduct, focusing particularly on whether he'd violated ethical boundaries with patients referred to Rachel's physical therapy practice. While they found no evidence of direct patient care violations, the investigation revealed that James had been falsifying timesheets and using hospital resources to facilitate his personal relationship, including scheduling unnecessary consultations and procedures to create opportunities for meetings with Rachel. His dismissal from the hospital came within 3 weeks, accompanied by a carefully worded press release about maintaining the highest standards of professional integrity and personal conduct. The Connecticut Medical Board opened their own investigation, ultimately placing restrictions on his license that effectively ended his ability to practice sports medicine in the state. The man who'd spent 15 years building a reputation as one of the region's premier orthopedic surgeons found himself unemployable in his chosen specialty. Rachel's professional destruction was even more complete. Michael, true to his word, about ensuring public accountability, filed formal complaints with every professional organization that governed physical therapy practice in Connecticut. His legal connections meant that these complaints were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly, revealing financial irregularities in Rachel's practice that extended far beyond her personal deceptions. The investigation uncovered that Rachel had been overbilling insurance companies for treatments that were never provided, using the extra income to fund her lifestyle and her relationship with James. She'd also been manipulating patient referral patterns to create artificial demand for her services, particularly from patients that James had directed to her practice. The combination of insurance fraud and professional misconduct resulted in criminal charges that sent her to federal prison for 18 months. Michael Montgomery's response to his wife's betrayal demonstrated the kind of dignified strength that made me understand why Rachel had been so foolish to risk losing him. He filed for divorce immediately, but he also did something that surprised everyone. He reached out to me directly, not seeking commiseration or shared misery, but offering practical support for the legal and financial challenges I was facing. Our friendship, which developed organically from our shared experience of public humiliation, became one of the most unexpected and valuable relationships in my new life. Michael understood the unique psychological challenges of discovering that someone you'd trusted completely had been systematically deceiving you for months. He also brought a perspective on forgiveness and moving forward that helped me process my anger constructively rather than allowing it to consume my future. The divorce proceedings with James were surprisingly straightforward, largely because his professional and financial destruction left him in no position to fight for anything. Our assets were divided according to Connecticut's equitable distribution laws, but since James's earning potential had been essentially eliminated, I retained most of our shared wealth along with the Rosewood Manor house, which I sold immediately. The sale of that house felt like closing a book whose story had been corrupted by lies. I didn't want to live surrounded by memories of a marriage that had been partially fabricated from the beginning. Instead, I used the proceeds to purchase this penthouse and to establish the financial independence that ensures I'll never again be vulnerable to someone else's deception. My career at Pemberton and Associates flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. The notoriety from the dinner party revelation, rather than damaging my professional reputation, actually enhanced it in unexpected ways. Other women facing similar situations of marital deception began seeking my services specifically, knowing that I understood both the technical aspects of financial investigation and the emotional complexities of discovering systematic betrayal. The firm created a new specialty division focused on matrimonial fraud investigation, with me as the senior partner. We now handle cases involving hidden assets, secret relationships, and financial deception in high-net-worth divorces throughout New England. My combination of technical expertise and personal experience with sophisticated marital deception made me uniquely qualified to help other people uncover truths they needed, but were afraid to discover. More importantly, I've learned that the analytical skills that initially blinded me to James's deception could be repurposed to create the kind of genuine relationships I'd been missing. I approach new friendships and potential romantic connections with the same methodical attention to detail I bring to fraud investigations. But now I use those skills to verify authenticity rather than to avoid uncomfortable truths. The woman who walked into that dining room 6 months ago, believing she could manipulate the narrative of her affair with my husband, had no idea she was confronting someone whose professional expertise involved destroying people who thought they were too clever to get caught. Rachel Montgomery learned, in the most public way possible, that some games are infinitely more dangerous than the players realize. James discovered that the wife he'd taken for granted, the woman he'd assumed would never question his elaborate lies, was actually someone who specialized in methodical investigation and had never lost a case in 15 years of professional fraud detection. His critical error was forgetting that his partner was someone who'd built her career on ensuring that people who believed their deceptions were too sophisticated to unravel learned exactly how wrong they were. Tonight, as I prepare dinner in my beautiful new kitchen, I'm expecting Michael to arrive for our weekly Sunday evening tradition. We cook together, discuss our work, and share the kind of honest conversation that neither of us had experienced in our respective marriages. It's not romantic. We're both too recently wounded for that kind of vulnerability, but it's genuine in ways that feel revolutionary after years of unknowingly living with systematic deception. The view from this penthouse reminds me daily that perspective changes everything. From down in the valley of my marriage to James, I couldn't see the scope of the deception surrounding me. But from up here, with clarity and distance, I can see for miles in every direction, and I never intend to be trapped in someone else's lies again. Tomorrow, I'm starting work on a new case involving a prominent Hartford businessman whose wife suspects he's been hiding assets offshore while planning to leave her for a younger colleague. It's exactly the kind of sophisticated financial deception that makes my pulse quicken with professional excitement, and I intend to unravel it with the same methodical thoroughness that exposed James and Rachel's affair. The woman who specialized in following money trails had learned to follow emotional trails with equal precision, and the results were devastatingly effective for anyone foolish enough to underestimate her capabilities. Justice, I've discovered, tastes even better when it's served with perfect timing and professional-grade evidence, witnessed by exactly the right people to ensure that the consequences extend far beyond personal embarrassment into permanent professional and social accountability. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.